Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into something fascinating, an AI that seems to learn language in a way that, well, mirrors our own brains.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting stuff. We're looking at a new paper that just dropped on RCIF, plus some chatter from, those AI channels, AI Revolution, and AI Beyond Infinity.
Exactly. And it's all centered around this model called TopoLM. That's TOPOLM for Topographic Language Model.
Right. And the core concept, the really big idea, is that it's not just learning language, it's organizing that knowledge spatially, kind of like our brains do.
Okay, so let's set the stage for you listening. Our mission today is to unpack how this AI pulls off this brain-like learning and, crucially, why it actually matters.
And there's a really neat surprise baked in here. The model seems to develop its own little neighborhoods, functional clusters for things like nouns and verbs.
Just like the brain.
Yeah, exactly. All emerging from a surprisingly simple underlying rule. It's pretty elegant, actually.
Okay, so let's dive into that brain-like part. You mentioned spatial organization. How do we know the brain even does that for language?
Well, through neuroscience, mainly fMRI scans, they show these localized spots, these blobs in the brain that light up for specific language jobs like processing verbs or nouns or syntax.
And these blobs aren't just randomly scattered, are they?
No, that's the key. They often tend to be physically close to each other, which suggests location matters.
Okay, and this isn't totally out of the blue for AI, right? You mentioned vision research.
Exactly. In deep learning for vision, there was this principle, something like keep nearby neurons similar in their activity. And when they applied that,
What happened?
well, these models started developing patterns that looked uncannily like the processing stages in our visual cortex, detecting edges, then shapes, then objects. It kind of merged naturally from that spatial rule.
So the big question that TopoLM folks were asking was, could that same trick, that sort of wiring cost idea, work for language, which feels much more abstract than vision?
Precisely. Could forcing nearby artificial neurons to cooperate somehow lead to a brain-like organization for language? And TopoLM is basically their attempt to answer that.
So tell us about TopoLM itself. Who's behind it?
It's coming out of the NeuroAI lab at EPFL in Switzerland. The team's led by Assistant Professor Martin Cramp and includes Rothy, Johannes Mayor, Bad Al Kamissi, and a few others.
And the model itself, what's under the hood?
So the foundation is basically a smallish GPT-2 architecture. Think 12 transformer blocks, 16 attention heads, about 784 hidden units per layer. Not enormous by today's standards.
But the twist is the layout.
That's the key innovation. Instead of those 784 units just being, abstract points in math space, they're explicitly placed onto a 2D grid, a 28 by 28 grid specifically.
Okay, so each unit has coordinates, like a location on a map.
Exactly. It gives the model a sense of physical space, which is totally missing in standard language models.
But just putting them on a grid,
Yeah.
it doesn't automatically make it brain-like, does it? How do they make that spatial arrangement mean something?
Right. Good question. That comes down to the training. They have two main goals or objectives when training TopoLM.
Okay, what are they?
The first one is standard stuff for language models.
Yeah.
Predict the next word in a sequence. Learn grammar, meaning, context.
Makes sense. And the second?
The second is the secret sauce. It's what they call spatial smoothness loss.
Spatial smoothness loss. Okay, break that down. What's the gist?
The gist is it encourages units that are neighbors on that 28 by 28 grid to have correlated activations. If two units are right next to each other, the model gets a little reward if their activity patterns are similar.
Okay. So closer together means they should act more alike.
Pretty much. And the further apart they are on the grid, the less pressure there is for them to be similar. It's like saying, hey, if you're neighbors, you should probably be working on related things.
It's like building in a bias for local cooperation.
Exactly. They use Pearson correlation mathematically, but the concept is just closer units, more like activity. And they found through testing, hyperparameter tuning, that putting a decent weight on this loss, like 2.5 times the standard loss, was really important.
Right. You needed enough influence to actually shape the organization.
Without completely messing up the primary goal of, understanding language.
And they trained this on a lot of data, right?
Oh, yeah. 10 billion tokens from the FineWeb EDUCE corpus. Big academic and web text data set. Needed some serious GPU power, obviously.
So after all this training with the standard goal and this spatial smoothness rule, what happened? Did it actually organize itself like a brain?
Well, the evidence is pretty compelling. They started seeing what they call functional clustering. Across the different layers of the model, these chunky islands of units started to emerge.
Chunky islands, I like that.
Yeah, it's a good visual. These islands weren't random. They became highly selective for different aspects of language processing. Like you might see one area becoming really active for nouns, another for verbs.
Okay, but how do they prove these islands are doing brain-like things, not just, random blobs?
Good point. They used tests inspired directly by neuroscience. One key one is called Fedorenko's language localizer task.
How does that work?
You basically compare how the brain, or in this case, the AI, responds to real, meaningful sentences versus, say, sentences with the word scrambled or even complete nonsense words like jabberwocky.
Okay, and TopoLM.
It showed a hierarchy very similar to the human brain. The functional clusters responded most strongly to the normal sentences.
Makes sense.
Then they responded less, but still significantly, to the scrambled words and the jabberwocky type stuff. And they responded least of all to just random, meaningless sequences.
So it's sensitive to meaning and structure, much like our own language areas.
Exactly. And importantly, a control model, a similar GPT-2 without the grid and the spatial loss, didn't show this clear hierarchy. Its activity was much more diffuse, less organized.
That's pretty strong evidence. You mentioned nouns and verbs earlier. Did they look specifically at that distinction?
They did, and this is where it gets really fascinating. In human fMRI studies, if you look at how well nearby brain regions can tell nouns from verbs apart, the correlation is super high, like 0.96, really strong local specialization.
Okay, and TopoLM.
Just looking at the raw activity of the units, TopoLM got a correlation of about 0.48, which is, okay, but not brain level.
Right.
But, and this is the kicker, fMRI doesn't measure single neurons. It measures the averaged activity over a small area, right? It's a bit blurry.
Okay.
So they applied a similar blurring effect to TopoLM's 28 by 28 grid, averaging nearby unit activity. And when they did that, the correlation for telling nouns from verbs shot up to 0.81.
Wow. That's really close to the human brain level.
It's remarkably close. And the control model, the one without the spatial setup, it was down at 0.11, barely making the distinction at all.
So that spatial pressure, that smoothness loss, really makes a difference in organizing these fundamental categories.
It really seems to. And it gets even more nuanced. They looked at concrete versus abstract words.
Like hammer versus justice.
Exactly. Our brains process those differently. The nonverb distinction is much clearer for concrete words. And guess what?
TopoLM did the same thing.
Yep. It showed a strong noun-verb separation for concrete words correlation of 0.83, but a much weaker one for abstract words, only 0.23. It captured that subtlety.
Well, the baseline model just treated them all the same.
Pretty much, yeah. It completely missed that concrete abstract difference.
Okay, this is sounding incredibly brain-like. But often, when you optimize an AI, for one thing, like brain similarity, it might take a hit on standard performance tests.
Yeah.
How did TopoLM do on regular NLP benchmarks?
That's the crucial trade-off question, isn't it? They tested it thoroughly. On one specific test of grammatical judgment called BLIMP, it did score slightly lower than the non-spatial control model, 0.71 versus 0.76.
Okay, so a small dip in pure syntax checking.
A small dip, yeah.
Yeah.
But interestingly, on more practical downstream tasks, things included in the GLUE benchmark, like sentiment analysis, understanding inferences, identifying paraphrases, TopoLM actually showed a slight improvement over the control. It scored 0.68 compared to 0.65.
Huh. So maybe being more brain-like helps with broader understanding, even if there's a tiny hit on very specific grammar rules.
That could be one interpretation. And on another metric, brain score, which directly measures how well model activity predicts actual neural recordings, TopoLM performed basically on par with the control model.
So overall, it seems like you gain a lot in terms of brain-like organization and interpretability, maybe even some practical task benefits for a very small cost in one specific area.
That seems to be the takeaway, yeah. It's a pretty favorable trade-off.
You mentioned interpretability. They talk about this gorgeous cortical map. What's the significance there?
This is potentially huge. You know how we often call large language models black boxes?
Yeah, because it's impossible to see what's going on inside.
Right, just billions of numbers. But with TopoLM's grid, you can actually visualize where functions are happening. You can create a heat map of that 28 by 28 grid and see, look, this corner seems to be really involved in processing verbs.
So you can literally see the functional specialization emerging.
Exactly. Instead of abstract vectors, you have localized functions on a map. This is a massive step for understanding why the model makes certain predictions or behaves in certain ways.
And that opens doors, right? For
Yep.
debugging, finding biases.
Absolutely. Easier debugging, maybe identifying safety issues, even potentially doing targeted model surgery, editing specific functional areas. It makes the whole system less opaque.
That's incredibly promising. What about the other implications? They mentioned hardware.
Yeah, brain-inspired hardware. Our brains are super energy efficient, partly because related neurons are physically close, minimizing, communication distance and energy.
Makes sense. Less wiring.
Right. So if models like TopoLM with built-in spatial organization become more common, it could push chip design towards neuromorphic hardware. Chips where the physical layout actually reflects the functional layout.
Like a linguistic silicon cortex, as they put it.
Exactly. You could physically place the grammar units near the verb units, potentially saving a lot of energy and reducing latency.
That's a really cool long-term vision. And the clinical side, helping understand language disorders.
This is also really intriguing. Imagine trying to help a stroke patient who has trouble with verbs, a condition called agrammatism.
Okay.
TopoLM's maps showing where verb processing tends to cluster could potentially guide clinicians. Maybe it helps pinpoint areas for targeted therapies like TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, to encourage recovery.
So the AI's map could inform treatment for actual human brains.
That's the hope. And the researchers are apparently already collaborating with neuroimaging labs to see if they can find these predicted clusters in actual human brain scans areas that maybe haven't been clearly identified before.
Wow. Finding those would be huge validation.
Absolutely massive.
Now, we should also touch on limitations. No model is perfect. What do they acknowledge?
Yeah, they're upfront about it. One thing is that each transformer layer in TopoLM has its own 28 by 28 grid. They're kind of stacked, but separate.
Whereas the brain is more continuous.
Right, more of a continuous 3D structure with connections across layers and depths. Also, TopoLM is currently feed-forward information flows mostly one way. The brain is full of recurrent connections, feedback loops everywhere.
Okay, those are fair points. And they mentioned another model, Topoformer BERT. How does this compare?
Right, Topoformer BERT tried adding local connectivity constraints, mostly within the attention mechanism. It showed some hints of organization, but according to the EPFL team, it wasn't nearly as strong or global as TopoLM's.
So the differences.
TopoLM uses that global spatial smoothness objective across the whole grid, inherited from vision models. Topoformer was more focused on just local wiring within attention. It seems like the global pressure is what really drives this large-scale, brain-like map for language.
So it really comes back to that core principle, doesn't it? Keep nearby units similar.
It seems so. Such a simple idea, computationally.
But with profound effects, leading to these emergent properties, these functional clusters, this brain-like hierarchy, just from that one spatial rule layered on top of standard language learning.
Exactly. And the researchers speculate this might be a really fundamental organizing principle the brain uses, maybe not just for vision and language, but across many different cognitive domains.
And for AI, it points towards models that are maybe not just powerful, but also more interpretable, potentially safer, and maybe even more efficient down the line.
It's a very promising direction, moving beyond just scaling up black boxes.
And that potential mic drop moment we talked about, if fMRI studies actually find new language blobs in the human brain right where TopoLM predicts they should be.
That would be revolutionary. It would tie AI modeling and neuroscience together in an incredibly powerful way.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, TopoLM. It's a language AI built on a standard foundation, but with this crucial twist, a 2D grid, and a rule forcing nearby units to act similarly.
And out of that simple constraint emerges this really striking brain-like functional organization clusters for nouns, verbs, sensitivity to meaning, the concrete abstract distinction.
All things we see in neuroimaging studies of human language processing.
Right. And this comes with huge potential benefits. Making AI more understandable, inspiring new hardware, and potentially even giving us tools to better understand and treat neurological conditions affecting language.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? If one relatively simple, biologically plausible rule can unlock this kind of emergent organization, what other simple rules might be out there?
Yeah, what other fundamental principles of intelligence, biological or artificial, are we missing? What are the key ingredients needed, not just for performance, but for structured, understandable intelligence?
Definitely food for thought. What simple rules might govern complex thought itself? That's something to chew on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.